the very rapid growth of the reopening phase is now over, and we are in the slower growth recuperation phase. We expect fourth quarter growth to be just barely positive, weaker than previously expected due to the resurgence in COVID infections.
The upshot is that we are living today in a world where the risks of fiscal inaction outweigh the risks of fiscal action. Doing too little is more dangerous and potentially more costly than doing too much.
The economic recovery is going to be a slow and long slog, according to the Bank of Canada, but the federal government says they've got a calculated plan to get us through, and it's going to be very expensive. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland argues Canada has the fiscal firepower to do it without spending the country into oblivion, and that will be aided by the Bank of Canada's policy moves announced today. Peter Armstrong is CBC's senior business correspondent. He joins us from Toronto. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Mr. Cochran.
So, look, today, heavy on economic news, heavy on economic messaging. Let's start with the Bank of Canada. What do you think Tiff Macklem is hoping Canadians take away from this?
I think a few things. And I think basically, in his words, this is going to be a long slog, a long, hard slog to get through this. This recovery is going to take a long time, and its impact is going to be felt through the economy for years to come. I mean, they're talking about inflation coming back under control and thus interest rates staying where they are in like 2023. So that's a long time. But also that the Bank of Canada is doing everything it can. But as you say, the thing that really stuck out at me was messaging, that this wasn't a message to markets. This wasn't a message to, guys like me. This was a message directly to households. And, central bankers can be accused of talking in pretty dense jargon sometimes. That was not the case today. And just take a listen to this one clip from Macklem's Q&A of what he's trying to get done here.
What we're saying is that we're going to get through this, but it's going to be a long slog. And we're telling Canadians, and our forward guidance has been very clear, that we're going to hold our policy interest rate at the effective lower bound until slack is absorbed, so that we can sustainably achieve our 2% inflation target. And we've indicated that's not going to happen into some time into 2023. So what does that mean? Yes, it means that if you're a household considering making a major purchase, if you're a business considering investing, you can be confident that interest rates will be low for a long time.
Yeah, Peter, when he says the effective lower bound, he means rock bottom interest rates, essentially, right? So Macklem wraps up with a pretty explicit message to consumers and to businesses. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland starts a major speech today. Did the fiscal policy message from Freeland align with the monetary policy message from Macklem?
It did. And I think you and I, we know that fiscal policy works best when aligned with monetary policy and vice versa. And in a weird way, in the way that Macklem was trying to talk directly to Canadian households, it felt to me a little bit like Freeland was messaging a little bit more to markets and to sort of politicians more than directly to households, because it was less about what are they going to do and where are they going to spend and what is that fiscal policy going to look like. It was more a question of whether and what that should look like and whether we can afford it. And she had a very full-throated defense of not just the need to do it, but this moral imperative that if we don't do it, the damage of not spending and of not sort of making sure that everybody gets through this long, hard winter, paying the rent and keeping their businesses open and not going broke, that the damage would be worse than trying to be tight now. And it's funny, she wasn't just talking about the orthodoxy of the 1990s of, she's quoting the IMF and saying these, I think she called them, she called them names about how sort of orthodox they were in making sure austerity, the theologians of austerity, I think she called them, that she was saying they now too are saying that we have to spend and we have to make sure that citizens make it through this as well as businesses.
Yeah, the IMF was warning in the 90s. I think Canada was going to get onto junk bond status, and now it's spend. And so, Macklem's going to keep buying bonds. Freeland's going to keep spending money. They say the cost of not doing this is higher than the cost of doing this. But there are critics out there say, look, this is modern monetary theory. This is free money run amok. Was there a rebuttal or a pre-buttal to that criticism and what they had to say today?
There was, and I think from both. Macklem said, look, our job is to control inflation, and that's what we're doing. And if you look at the mechanics of what we're doing, that's the goal that we're aiming to get. And Freeland spoke a lot about sort of why and how this exists in the state that it is right now. And you see a lot of people reacting to that today on Twitter. Mike Moffat, the economist, saying, look, you couldn't take the orthodoxy from the 1930s and impose that on the 1970s any more than you can take the orthodoxy of the 1990s and impose it on 2020. And in a lot of ways, the thing that people are trying to remind everyone is it wasn't just orthodoxy, it wasn't just ideology that made people go into those austerity measures of the 1990s. It was the bond market, and the bond market is signaling something very different today.
All right, Peter, thanks so much for your time, man. That was great to talk.
You bet.
Whether on Bay Street or on Main Street, there are no blank checks. And there are no free lunches. Our fiscally expansive approach to fighting the coronavirus cannot and will not be infinite. It is limited and it is temporary.
Okay, so that was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland speaking earlier today, defending her government's bold plan for economic recovery. She says now is not the time for fiscal restraint, and the risk of doing too little outweighs the risk of doing too much. But how will the government know when to turn off the spending taps? For more, we're joined by Mélanie Joly, the Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages. She is in the House of Commons foyer. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Chrystia Freeland, the Finance Minister, she said essentially today, now is not the time to fear deficit spending. The government isn't going to rein it in, and it's not going to drop any fiscal anchors, as people like to call them. When will we know when it is time for a fiscal anchor to appear and for the government to start reining in spending a little bit?
Well, what clearly the finance minister has said today, and what we've been saying for now since the beginning of the pandemic, is we have a plan. And we were in a strong fiscal position before the pandemic. And what we need to do right now, like other countries are doing, is to make sure that we continue to support Canadians, to make sure that we protect their health, and we'll do everything that is required to do so. And also that we will be there for Canadian businesses that are facing really tough times, because we want to limit the economic scarring. And fundamentally, this is our plan to go through the pandemic, to go through this economic crisis, because we know that we're in a coronavirus recession, and therefore we need to be there for Canadians, and this is the right thing to do right now.
I think most people would agree there still is a need for emergency spending and stimulus spending because of where we are. But you look at the Governor of the Bank of Canada today, he gave markers of how long low interest rates would stay in place, looking at up to 2023, and outlined what he would do on buying bonds. I mean, why is it the central bank can give us at least some sort of timeline, but we can't get that from the federal government when it comes to fiscal policy?
Well, the central bank, of course, is independent, so I won't comment on that. What I can say, though, is that we have a long-standing history in Canada of putting rules and limits to make sure that we can have a strong fiscal position. We've done that, and we will continue to do so. What we know right now is that we have two options. It's either we are right now taking on the burden of Canadians and putting it on our shoulder as a government, or actually Canadians are going through more debt. And we know that Canada had the lowest net to GDP ratio before the pandemic, and it is expected that it is still the case of all the G7 countries, and also that interest rates are extremely low, way lower than, for example, in the 1990s, when Canada was facing real challenges when it came to its fiscal position. So based on that, we will continue to have a sound approach, which will be limited in time, of course.
Right, but it's coming up on, I think, almost 2 years now since we've had a budget in this town, an actual federal budget. Its fiscal updates have been the order of the day, and I think that's what we're probably going to get next month. I mean, how long should we expect the government to keep operating with fiscal updates and fiscal documents that fall short of the standard of a budget?
Well, of course, there will be a budget and there will be also a fiscal update. And we are very much aware that it is important for Canadians to have access to that information. At the same time, that is exactly why the Minister of Finance today made this speech, this very important speech to lay out the vision for Canadians to understand what we're doing, because we want to make sure that we reassure them that we're there for them, but at the same time, this is not a time for austerity. The IMF has said it, and also the World Bank, and therefore we will do what is required to go through this pandemic.
Governor Macklem at the Bank of Canada today said that interest rates will likely stay rock bottom, really low, until 2023. You guys are trying to have fiscal policy and monetary policy work together. Given that projection on low interest rates, should Canadians expect large-scale deficit spending going up to 2023?
Well, what we said would be it's not infinite, it's limited in time, but at the same time, we're trying to limit economic scaring. Like I said at the beginning, we want to make sure that we don't pass on a weak economy to our kids. We want to be there as we should. Right now, in this economic crisis, there are some sectors that are more impacted than others. We know that. We know also that the 3.7 million Canadians have benefited from the wage subsidy as of now. So, David, we will continue to protect jobs while creating jobs. And we've said in the throne speech, there's been 1 million jobs that have been lost since the beginning of this pandemic, and we're committed to making sure that we are recreating them again.
The projections we saw from the Bank of Canada today is that we've gone from this sort of rapid growth as we recovered a lot of the lost ground, and we're entering this period of slower and I think choppy growth is the way the governor described it. I mean, the fact that we're going into this slower period of growth, does that have any impact on your approach to stimulus?
Well, we will be there as of now to help Canadians, like I said. And of course, we will do what is required to make sure that we bounce back. We know other countries have come up with some stimulus packages. And of course, we will do what is required to make sure that we stimulate the demand, particularly in certain sectors that are more impacted.
Okay, and beyond stimulating demand, and one final point before we let you go, is you mentioned the throne speech. There were promises for targeted measures for industries hit extremely hard, such as travel and tourism, which I know falls into your portfolio.
Yes.
When are we going to see the specifics on that? Because those sectors are crying out for help.
Yes, like you said, I have the chance and the responsibility to support and represent the tourism sector and the hospitality sector. And folks in the sector have been crying out for help because obviously times are extremely difficult. We know that, and therefore we will be coming up with a plan in the coming weeks. And we know that this is usually a seasonal sector like other sectors, such as also the airline sector, and we need to be there to support them. We'll have more to say in the coming weeks on that. But of course, this is important because it is, of the job losses, a big part of the job losses that have occurred are in these sectors.
So coming weeks, so before the end of November, sometime next month?
In the coming weeks, David.
All right, Melanie Joly, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
The economic recovery is going to be a slow and long slog, according to the Bank of Canada, but the federal government says they've got a calculated plan to get us through, and it's going to be pretty expensive. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland argues Canada has the fiscal firepower to do it without spending the country into oblivion, and that will be aided by the Bank of Canada's near-zero interest rates and bond buying. For reaction to all of this, I'm joined by the President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, Goldie Hyder. He's right here in Ottawa. Goldie, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
A lot of economic news and economic messaging today from the Finance Minister, from the Bank of Canada Governor. What's your reaction to the news from the Bank of Canada and your sense of where our economy stands right now?
I concur. I think we are in for a long haul. I think it's going to be uneven. I think it's going to be choppy. The K reference comes in terms of some are going to do very well and others are going to have some real challenges. And so we're going to have a response to that. And it's going to have to happen while we have the pandemic. I think that today when Minister Freeland talked about some of her intentions towards the plan, it is important to note that we can't wait for the pandemic to go while trying to help these people, restart their lives and restart their economic lives in particular.
Yeah, I mean, Freeland made it clear that she's prepared to spend and spend big. And it seemed to me, and my colleague Peter Armstrong, Tiff Macklem was trying to convince people to maybe spend a bit if they can by talking about how interest rates are going to be near rock bottom, near the lower bound, as he likes to say, until 2023. I mean, does that kind of reassurance and forward guidance, does that convince people to make investments and spend if they're able to?
Well, look, confidence is key here. We have a demand side problem. And so the governor is obviously right in saying we've got to create conditions in which people feel confident that the economy is going to be okay, that we're going to be able to manage our way through the pandemic, however long it might be with us. And let's be clear, it's going to be with us for a while. And we just have to be honest with people. The government has responded early on, I think, to do everything that they can to put a floor on the collapse of the lives of individuals. That created confidence. Some have said that, in fact, there's been an overstimulation. I'm saying internationally, people who look at us say, if you lost $28 billion worth of wages in Canada, did we really need to do $56 billion or so, RBC numbers, in terms of wage subsidies for people? No wonder savings are up. No wonder the governor of the Bank of Canada is saying, hey, why don't you spend some of that money here in Canada, go out and about. And that means we've got to get our health response right. And today I wrote to the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland and called for an independent review, David, that is nonpartisan, that is not political, that is not about blame and name and shame. It is much more about taking stock of where are we as a country in our response to the pandemic. Because if it is going to be a long time, we should learn the lessons now and not wait for it until it's all over.
Well, who would you want to do that review? Because you've seen what's happening at committees, right?
Yeah.
And partisanship is driving a lot of it. I think it's fair to say. So who are the nonpartisan experts that we can kind of trust to take a look at it and come up with a plan?
I think we've got ample examples of people like that. I won't name anyone. I don't want to put them on the spot, but certainly healthcare, people with healthcare experience and healthcare background, including former ministers of health or former deputy ministers of health. We may even have some former Supreme Court justices or others who've handled a lot of cases related to healthcare and jurisdiction and all those kinds of things. There is no shortage of experts that I think would be available. The thing is, we need to do it. As I said, I think it's important that this is a depoliticized process. We in the business community want to work collaboratively with governments, with Canadians, and with other businesses, because for us to all be in this together, we frankly need to be doing better. And I mean all of us. This is not an indictment of any particular government. It's actually a call to action for governments, businesses, and Canadians to make sure we understand what each of us can do to make sure that we're not playing whack-a-mole with this virus, because that's not a strategy. And that's what we're doing, as you've seen over the last 8 months.
So you agree with the assessment that Tiff Macklem put out today, the governor of the Bank of Canada. What about the plan, or at least the statement of intention from the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, where she said, now is not the time to fear deficits. The cost of not spending right now will be much worse than the cost of actually spending, though with some reassurance that it's not a bottomless plan. A fiscal anchor is going to appear at some point. What's your reaction to what the finance minister said today?
Well, I think you nailed it by saying intentions are one thing. These are the good. There were certainly a lot of good signals in her remarks today. I mean, she denounced, MMT theory. She supported the need for fiscal discipline, and she called on the importance of deficits and that they matter. She indicated there would be fiscal guardrails as we go forward, and she talked about fiscal anchor, something that we've been calling for and we believe needs to be a part of the economic statement. And she was very specific with Canadians, saying, look, while we're saying, we're going to do whatever it takes, hopefully the investments that we're going to be making are going to be time limited. Our message to her is keep your fiscal firepower, because we don't know where this virus is going. We've spent a lot of money, David, and I think if we took stock of that, there's perhaps some spending we didn't need to do. That's done, that's fine, but now we need to say as we go forward, how do we target this better to help Canadian individually, but also Canadian businesses, because those Canadians need jobs to go back to, and we need to find not only the 1 million or so jobs or 750,000 or so jobs that are still left to be filled. Let's grow our economy, right? We should be having a plan to grow our way out of this, not finance our way out of it.
But, there are people like yourself who want to see a fiscal anchor here, some sort of, line in the sand that they will not cross in spending to sort of bring some discipline to the whole thing. But, the Prime Minister and others say we're still in the emergency phase. Tiff Macklem points out to 2023 as rock bottom interest rates. I mean, how do you know? Yeah. You're not going to see a fiscal anchor in the fiscal update. So when do you know it's time to start turning the taps back a little bit? What do you look for?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't give up just yet on the idea that we won't see it in the fiscal update, because people told us its own speech was going to be about something and then it wasn't, right? Because events, my dear boy.
It's Ottawa. People say a lot of things.
I'll say to you that I think the government's going to be under enormous pressure, not just internally, but more importantly, David, and very seriously here, externally. Right? I mean, when it comes to the credit agencies, when it comes to markets and investors, they're very dispassionate when it comes to the issue of math. They look at this not from your intentions and your feelings and your wants and needs. It's about what are you planning on doing? And I say this with great respect. You know, this government is right when it says that there was a strong economy, the debt to GDP ratio was good, unemployment was low heading into the virus. But you know what was not well received by international markets and credit agencies and others is it never met a fiscal target it set. From the time it ran for office in 2015, the 10 billion target, and then paying it all off and no deficits by 2019. Now, of course, all that's off the charts. I think credibly, they need to say something specific, even if it is conditional on a vaccine, and even if those anchors are not met. But saying nothing, I think, would have impact on the choices that investors make in credit agency ratings, which of course spirals into borrowing costs, right, and therefore affects Canadians.
You made a key point there, though, that it has to be conditional, right? Because we do not know where this is going. And I mean, but how would the markets take that? I mean, if you say we would, what sort of an anchor are you looking for? Is it a debt to GDP ratio by this date? Is it a deficit by this date? What would it need to be? Or do you just want one?
No, I think it's in the government's interest to have one, to have something to ground itself by. We know that internally in this party, there are people who perhaps support MMT and want to spend freely. And, the idea that low interest rates represent a strategy. That's not a strategy. We actually need an economic growth plan. And in order to do that, we have to attract investment. We need to have a plan to grow our economy. And we have to attract immigrants and skills and, address the infrastructure deficit that we have and all of those things. So spend with purpose. Create the conditions that would cause you to spend and invest in some of the things I've talked about. Be clear. You will be, I think, punished for leaving it obscure, and you will be rewarded for being clear about it. Even if you miss it, people are willing to be, I think, empathetic to the fact that, hey, there's a pandemic underway. We're doing our best to make predictions here, but not saying anything a month from now or so when the economic statement will be. There will be consequences. I'm afraid I'm going to have to come back and say I told you so one day, but I prefer not to have to do that.
Okay, well, Goldie, we'll definitely have you back probably on the day of that fiscal update. It's always great to talk to you. That's Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.